All right. That's not.
All right. So I agree with a lot of what you said.
Awesome.
I'm a computer science major, so I certainly understand the need for more energy, and certainly we need portable, dense energy for cars and transportation and things.
Okay.
Here's my concern.
Okay.
Fracking, I mean, you yourself said any technology that's deployed in a lot of places, there's going to be some additional risk from that, right?
Yes.
You have a huge number of wells, there's a greater chance you're going to have bad casings and things. So that would seem to be an argument that there should be stronger regulation on fracking to help prevent these problems, when in fact it gets numerous exemptions from various federal environmental and safety standards. And my concern is that that's, the more regulations they have to comply with, the more expensive it is to do the fracking. So it's not really on a level playing field with other forms of energy. And are they, it seems to me like they might be getting a subsidy that's being paid in human life. I mean, if it was regulated as closely as nuclear is, for example, would it still be profitable?
Well, nothing would be profitable if it were regulated like nuclear is, but that's an indictment of how nuclear is regulated. I mean, nuclear is completely, I mean, it's the energy equivalent of racism, how nuclear is treated in this country.
Why aren't we trying to decrease regulation on nuclear and use that more to fuel some of our energy?
Can you pass around that chip? Okay, so, well, let me just make clear, I'm in favor of objective, equal laws for all of these things. So if you have a law about safety, it should apply equally in the same way to nuclear, coal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you have, a law about what's an acceptable level of emission, it should be, I mean, there are a lot of factors involved, but I don't believe in special preferences. So what I'm defending right now is not the status quo necessarily, it's the freedom to engage in this basic behavior. But I don't think as a factual matter fracking gets any sort of special preference. I think on net, the oil and gas industry gets tremendous impediments in the form of, we don't really have private property in this country anymore, so it takes an immense amount of resources and time just to get any sort of permission to develop anything. So I think if you were to advocate, if you have the kind of system that's really an equal playing field and truly fair, then what you would have is something in which there was a lower regulatory burden on everyone, because your focus would really just be on safety and dangers to human life. But let me just say, for nuclear, it is an outrage the way it is regulated, because it's regulated as if it poses a uniquely large danger to human life. And yet, if you look at what has the highest rate of fatalities and what has the lowest rate of fatalities for any form of energy, nuclear energy is clearly the safest form of energy that's ever been created. It's also the cleanest form of mass energy that's ever been created. So I regard it as very, I think there's a quasi-religious voodoo-esque opposition to nuclear, which is based on a fundamental hostility toward the transformation of nature. So when I say, I run Center for Industrial Progress, a lot of industrial progress is the transformation of nature using energy and technology. And what you'll find with a lot of the hostility toward different forms of energy is it comes down to, we shouldn't be changing nature, we shouldn't be making a footprint. That's another form of it. This is killing bats, so it shouldn't be allowed. And nuclear, because you're, quote, tampering with nature at the most fundamental level, even though it's actually the safest by every metric, and if you understand the technology, they are incredibly hostile to it. Other questions?
This isn't a question, but I want to say that you have a really good newsletter, I get.
Oh.
just so people know. It's
Oh.
very informative.
Thank you. Well, I'll pay you after for plugging it. Yes?
Is there any way to know what's going to happen miles under the ground in the next 50 or 60 years? These chemicals are there, and what's going to happen later? Is there going to be a problem that we don't know about, or
Well, what do you mean? The chemicals aren't usually there. I mean, they're usually, so if you talk about the chemicals that are used in the fracking process, they're usually stored in some place that has a very large amount of geological certainty to it. So there are many places underground where basically nothing changes for very large amounts of time, and they're sealed off. So that's generally where you want to put stuff. But there's a certain, I want to comment on this issue of chemicals, because there's an economist, George Reisman, who writes really well on these issues. And he points out that the green movement has become so pervasive that chemical is now regarded as a bad word. But I mean, chemical is that's just how we describe the basic elements of nature. The fact that something that we put together a combination of elements instead of nature putting it together doesn't make it safer or not safer. What we need to do is objectively investigate what are the dangers. And a lot of this stuff, like these cool chemicals that are in fracking fluid that we should be afraid of, you're a lot better off drinking them than drinking soda. If you look at the actual effects, it's kind of like nuclear. It's just assumed that, oh my gosh, this is because it's man-made in this way, it must be the most dangerous thing. Whereas, a nuclear power plant, I mean, I always joke, but it's not a joke. People ask, a friend of mine asked me once, well, wouldn't you, Alex, I know you think nuclear power is the safest form, but like, wouldn't you be afraid to live next to a nuclear power plant? And I said, well, obviously not, because I mean, I know what the real danger next to my house is, and it's the street. I mean, I guarantee, there's a chance that someone in this building right now is going to die on a street. There's a good statistical chance, not to be dark or anything like that. None of you guys are going to die from nuclear power. Just like no one in Japan.
Her question made me think that, now, when you say you have fracking and you use this hot water and chemicals and sand, does that stay down when you put it in the earth? Does it stay there, or do you extract that as well?
No, you're bringing it out.
You extract
But then there's an issue of what do you do with that? It's sort of this mixture and where do you stick it? Because you don't want to just put it in the local creek or in the local tap water supply.
Right.
So that's why you need a storage place. The nice thing about the world is that it's really, really, really big. But really, really, really big.
Yeah, but what kind of, maybe that's another cost in taking it to a storage.
Right, no, but the person who does it should pay the cost, and they do.
But what sort of storage place do you need to get, where do you dispose of it?
Well, it could just be any kind of like underground place, as I said before, that it's closed off and it doesn't modify much. So with nuclear, for instance, there's discussion of places near, there's a lot of salt deposits. Salt deposits don't change much throughout history, so they're a good place to put stuff you don't want. I mean, there's storage of stuff is generally a very overrated problem. The other thing is that with anything, if you need to, you can dilute it enough so it's not a big deal. I mean, poison, there's this old aphorism about, it's not about it's all about the dosage. So if anything is diluted enough, basically it's not going to be a problem. So I can tell you things that would sound scary, like, well, low-level nuclear waste. That sounds like, how can you put that anywhere? Isn't it going to be a three-eyed fish like The Simpsons? But the truth of the matter is that if you put a certain kind of low-level nuclear waste in a certain body of water, healthy fish populations will actually increase because it's warmer. And warmth, contrary to the global warming mania, is a very, very desirable commodity on Earth. There's not nearly enough of it. I mean, organisms generally want a lot more of it than they have, certainly in the water. Yes?
I've heard the argument that fracking tends to lead to more earthquakes. Is there any truth in that?
Yes, that's a good one too. I mean, a good issue to raise, not necessarily a good. So, I mean, it's interesting, how many earthquakes would you guess? I'm just curious, how many people, I don't know how to pull this, but I don't think most people realize how many earthquakes occur in the earth just all the time. I mean, thousands and thousands. Earthquakes is just a very, very normal state. What we experience, say I live in Southern California, once in a while we feel the ground shake, maybe we'll notice it a couple times a year. But there are thousands and thousands of things happening. And the thing to be careful with is, are you at some place geologically where there's really a fault or something that could spark something that's big? Because, I mean, almost by definition, if you're breaking apart rock, in a sense you're making it quake, right? And you're creating some form of movement. I mean, when you're drilling, in a sense, now I don't know exactly what the threshold for a quake is, but the general thing is these are very, very low level, and if you're focused on just, does this affect human life, they're no big deal at all. But as I mentioned in connection with nuclear, the focus is often that it's somehow wrong for us to transform nature, and so they hear human being made earthquake, oh my God, how could we do such an evil thing? Not actually looking at just the objective benefits and harms. But if you look at it without that anti-human prism on it, 99% of the time, it's no big deal. I can't say categorically that it's never a big deal, but again, that would be something where you would, you would want geologists based on real scientific standards assessing the consequences to human beings. But unfortunately, what they usually do in the environmental law today is they assess the consequences on nature with the idea that nature shouldn't be disturbed, and so anytime we change it, it's a problem. And that's, so by that standard, you shouldn't be allowed to frack at all because the ground moves when you crack it open. Yes?
I have a question on the origin of all this, and maybe you've gone over this at the beginning, I can't remember, I don't know, but I understand that drilling for gas is something that's been going on since World War II or after World War II.
Drilling for gas?
Yes.
For natural gas?
Yes.
Oh, sure.
Right, but I don't know if it occurred before that or not, but.
Do you mean fracking for gas or just?
Well, I don't know what pre-fracking drilling methods there may have been, and precisely when fracking started, I don't know the origin of that. But I know that the Marcellus Shale isn't something that they just discovered 2 years ago. I mean, it's been known that it's been there for a very long time.
Right.
So my question is why is this all getting underway in the course of the last few years? Why haven't we seen drilling in northwestern Pennsylvania decades ago when drilling has occurred elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is that thing still getting passed around? I'm curious. Did it get passed around in the back? Did you guys in the back get it? Okay, perfect. Can you just hand it over there so I don't lose it? I don't want to forget all of you. So yeah, this sort of by implication, I talked mostly about the case of oil, but what I said about oil applies equally to gas. I mean, you have phases in the history where you usually start out with the easiest to access stuff and then go from there. With gas, it's actually funny because kind of like oil used to be regarded as a nuisance when people were trying to find salt underground. Gas was a real nuisance because it killed people. Because gas and oil are neighbors and they're cousins geologically. So when you drilled, often what happened is you'd have a geyser, and part of that would be pressure from gas, and it could explode. And this is a real problem. So it's amazing that you went from it being a health hazard to something that was beneficial, but then once they found it beneficial, there's a question of how, what sorts of formations can you get it out of, and there are similar principles involved. It needs to be the type of rock that it'll actually flow through, and with the shale, it's not flowing through. So just as you couldn't get out the oil, so you couldn't get out the gas. So I don't know the exact geological composition of Marcellus in terms of how much of it, if any, was accessible, but in terms of it now being the most treasured gas place in the US, that's the product of the modern evolution of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracture.
So I was wondering if there was some recent development in the technology of that extraction
that
enables it to be extracted now as opposed to 30 years ago.
I mean, in a sense, fracturing has been around for a while, but it's like anything, it evolves. And the horizontal drilling in particular has really taken off in recent years, and your ability to go as low as you need to. So it's one thing to be able to do it at this level, it's another thing to go like 6,000 miles underground, and then getting the exact right mixture of chemicals. So at a certain, I mean, I honestly don't know the exact technological progression. I just know that, I know the basic arc, and I know that in North Dakota, you had a guy named Harold Hamm who was really the pioneer, and with gas, you had a guy named George Mitchell who was really the pioneer, and it was just getting this process exactly right, because it wasn't a process that was developed for shale, it was a process that was developed for other things. But then they figured out how to really fine tune it for shale, and now that they've cracked the code, just all these things are open. And what I expect to happen is that they'll, in the next 10, 20 years, refine it that much more, because I'm sure there are shale deposits right now that either they can't get at or that are too expensive, and you would expect those prices will come down. So this gives me the opportunity to talk about a pet peeve of mine, which is the oil company Chevron, which is the CEO actually seems like a decent guy whenever he gets interviewed, but they have all of these commercials which are basically saying the oil industry is a bunch of losers who are trying to get into solar and wind. And it's called I Agree, and they say all of these anti-oil things that they agree with, and one of them is oil companies should act more like technology companies. So this is one of the greatest technological developments in the last 50 years, and yet they act like they're not technology companies. companies, which just feeds into this mythology that all oil companies do is stick a straw underground and suck out a bunch of stuff. I mean, it's the technology on it, whether it's deep water drilling or fracking, is just without, in many ways, without parallel in any other industry. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I work for a construction flagging company that works for a lot of the fracking locations here in Pennsylvania. So I've been on a bunch of the sites, Anadarko up in Clinton County, some of their sites. And maybe it's lost in the media, I don't know, and talking to a lot of the locals, a lot of their problems, they love the fact that they're drilling for gas. Don't get me wrong, they love that. It's in their backyard and everything. The bigger problem that they're seeing and that the media won't pay attention to is all these companies are coming in from Texas and West Virginia. And I mean, every plate I see, it's either Texas or West Virginia. And they're buying up all the houses that have been foreclosed on, which is driving up all the taxes and everything else that they're paying. So they're having to pay for that. But then also, you were talking about risks. The tractor trailer crashes and everything else. I mean, I've been up at the one location at least once a week. They have an 18-wheeler come down the hill and run into the side of the mountain on a major road through Pennsylvania. And the roads get shut down. They're cleaning up messes. Last week I was up there and we had 2 trucks that were leaking diesel fuel and caused a big mess. And that's what they're complaining about is what's being done to fix those problems. Is there anything going on in the industry that, okay, are they making better trucks? Are they figuring out how to make less trips with these trucks? Things like that. Are they building houses on the pads, up near the pads, instead of buying up all the local houses and then when they run out of gas, they just up and leave? That's the biggest thing that they're complaining about, and what's being done maybe down in Texas or whatever, where they've done this for a little bit longer.
Yeah, that's a really good issue. I'm glad you raised that issue. So whenever you have, I mean, this is a general trend in technology. Whenever you have any kind of new disruptive technology in the sense of it's changing a lot of things, the government has to evolve in terms of it has to pay attention to that, including things like are people's rights getting violated or given our current oversight. So let's take the issue of the 18-wheelers, where you have just a much higher concentration of traffic than you had before. So it's a question of what do you, and before, let's say they were monitoring it at a certain level, but it was monitoring it based on previous usage, and now let's say the usage is quadrupled. Yeah, at the very least, you need more oversight, that kind of thing. So I'd say the main principle, I don't have anything to say about the companies. I mean, I don't represent the companies. I don't stand, I mean, I'm grateful to them in general, but I certainly don't represent or defend any given company. I have no idea what they do in particular. I just believe they should be free to frack within the context of protecting everyone's rights. But that's the key thing here, is the context of protecting everyone's rights. So with some of the issues there, I wouldn't regard it as a rights issue. So for instance, the buying up houses, and this is a very big issue in North Dakota, and the real estate has gone sky high, there's just tons and tons of trailers. I regard that as they have every right to do that. Now, if the government messed up stuff with regard to the foreclosure, which I think it did in various ways, that's a different story. When you're talking about the roads, it becomes ambiguous, because one issue with the government controlling all the roads is the government has to then make decisions about when do we increase roads and when don't we. I mean, in very long time ago, you had more private roads, in which case what would happen is people would just build more roads. And you'd have certain rules, and the other passengers on the roads would be able to complain if there were too many trucks, and then they'd build a road straight for them. So as much as possible, that's what should happen. So if they could open it up for private road development. But I would say insofar as the government has taken charge of the roads in a way I don't approve of, it should still exercise responsibility. So if there's a lot of crashes and stuff, it should exercise responsibility. It's really important to separate that issue and to really focus on that issue, but not to blend that with this like anti-industrial hostility. And I think what happens is because the anti-industrial hostility gets all the press, the real problems don't get addressed. And there are going to be real problems. And I've heard of similar things in Texas. So what I say, fracking being this amazing thing, it's the technology that's amazing, and then it's the freedom to do it that's amazing. But the freedom has to exist with the proper rights. And the government, when it's focused on all these other things, including just caving into anti-technology zealots, often loses its basic function of protective rights. So I totally agree that more action should be taken, and I hope it is. Yes.
The so-called Halliburton loophole in the 2005 Energy Policy Act exempts oil and gas producers, those engaged in hydraulic fracturing, from certain requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act and other environmental protection legislation. This loophole is something that former VP Dick Cheney has been working on since 2001. My question to you is, why does the self-aggrandizing fracking industry purposely want to circumvent laws meant to protect the American people, and what have they got to hide?
So what do you think is the essence of what privilege they're getting is from that? And because it sounds really ominous, Halliburton loophole, but like what are they getting?
They're being exempt from 6 laws that I have right
But
here.
what is the essence of the
From
laws?
disclosing specifically the chemicals that are involved in hydraulic fracturing and what adverse effects they have on health.
Okay, so they've already, I mean, that's sort of already played out in that they publicly disclose it, so if you go on the website, you can.
I have, it's a very cute graph that has like 99% water and salt, or water and sand, and then the rest is a very small.
No, I get that.
kind of
I'm glad you find
minimized
it, I mean, it doesn't really matter whether you find it cute or not, it's that it's an itemized list of the other things, of the chemicals. But again, these are, so I honestly, off the top of my head, I mean, I researched this issue about a year ago, and then I regarded it as some sort of distortion, and I forget all of the details about it. I just know with the chemicals, what you have going on is they are disclosed. I don't think they should have had to. In terms of their safety, there's a lot more dangerous stuff going on, and people are not dying from this stuff. This is just a hostility toward the idea of chemicals. Let me talk about fracking and chemicals. The fracking people, the better you can frack, the more cheap energy you can get, the better more people are gonna benefit. The more, the more agriculture they're gonna have, the more everything they're gonna have. They should use every chemical they can think of to maximize the amount of gas they get from those wells, unless there's reason to think that they're going to damage anyone. And there's no reason to think they're going to damage anyone. So to take a more extreme example, many decades ago, a woman named Rachel Carson brought out a book called Silent Spring, where she condemned the evil chemical DDT and made up a bunch of stuff, or I don't know if she thought she was making it up, but basically it led the US to ban it, and it led to a huge amount of pressure internationally to ban it. And this was something that was the most life-giving material basically in the world. According to the liberal National Academy of Sciences, this saved 500 million lives, up to I think 1970. I mean, so it saved even more later. And tens of millions of people died prematurely because of restrictions on DDT. And it was because there is this idea that if it's man-made, if it's a man-made chemical, it's bad. And if it's nature's chemical, it's good. So what I would like from people is if they have evidence that people are actually getting sick, they should submit that to the government, and then people should get prosecuted for it. And then they shouldn't do that. But this is not, what's happening is it's anti-technology hostility restricting progress. Yes, you wanted to say something?
I have a point about DDT. If you want to keep talking, I can come back to it.
No, I'm done.
Okay.
With that.
People weren't getting hurt by DDT, but it was hurting a lot of birds of prey, like almost all of them, and I don't think that's in dispute, right? People know that.
Eagles, falcons.
No, definitely the degree of in which it was in dispute. But okay, but I don't know what kind of math you want to do with tens of millions of people and some falcons.
People die every day, but I don't think it's morally right to go and make a
Yes, but they don't die 30 years early every day unless you kill them.
Okay, so we're going to make whales and bears extinct, but people can live for 15 more years. Is that a good deal?
I don't know why if
You're
people
sort of
like
playing God,
whales and
right?
bears enough, then obviously they'll preserve them. But in general, if you ask me my emotional feeling about that, yeah, I would rather live 15 more years and have my friends and family rather than seeing us all die 15 years earlier. So, part of this goes philosophically to what is your standard of value? So for me, my standard of value when assessing nature is human beings. And that doesn't mean that human beings just destroy all of the rest of nature, because that makes no sense. But it's that we have a beneficial relationship. So if, for instance, if there's a ton of oil in Alaska, and we want to, someone wants to buy up that land and drill, he should be able to do that, even if it's, even if the caribou have to move a couple of miles to the left. And now, in fact, they really like it because, as I said, warmth is at a premium in the world, so they love hanging out around oil rigs. But even if they didn't, I would, human life comes first, and so I evaluate. So, like, I love nature, I love going out in it, but I love it for the sake of human beings. I don't think it should, and you have to really make a choice, because otherwise, every time you choose nature over human beings, you're saying some people should die earlier. And I don't want to say that. Yes.
Couple things. One, I want to know if you actually know the chemicals that are used.
I've read the
off
list.
the top of your head.
Do I know?
Just for my own curiosity, because I haven't read the list. So
I
I'm
could look it
curious
up on my
what-
iPhone afterward. I mean, it's very easy to find. I just
Okay.
read the list today. Let's put it that way. But I have a decent memory. But
Or if anybody else happens to have it on hand, I'd like to.
but I don't know what difference it makes. But okay, so what's
I'm a chemist.
okay?
So, I know whether or not they're dangerous. Second point is, you brought up don't pollute, dilute, which was the attitude in this country for a long time and in State College and everywhere around here until it basically made Spring Creek dead, Susquehanna River was dead. So don't pollute, dilute is sort of a
Okay,
fallacy in your,
but that's a bit
in
of
your
a
statement.
But you're ascribing that little clever slogan to what I said, which is I think
That's what you said.
Okay, well, let me say it again, the exact same way.
I know
you
what
can
you
see if
said.
it's the same thing. Well, it's all on tape, so we can look at it later. But anyway, let me clarify my position now. The issue is that dilution is a valuable way of dealing with dangers of concentrated chemicals.
Yes.
Now, obviously, it no longer becomes valid if you continually pour more and more of the same thing into the same body because it's no longer diluted, right? But
Right.
the problem is that it's not diluted. So for me,
Right.
all I said is that diluting is effective, but that implies that then reconcentrating is not.
Okay.
So this is in connection with things like if some amount of some chemical gets into a very, very large, on an accident gets into a very, very large aquifer, everyone is not going to die. That's
Right.
the only point. It's not that and I said specifically we shouldn't dump it. They shouldn't dump it in. So it's just that dilution is a mechanism to use in the tool chest of protecting human beings from potential safety threats.
Okay. I just want to make sure you're careful about how you say that.
Okay,
Is it-
I appreciate. I didn't know that historical expression, so I'll steer clear of it in the future.
The third one goes back to what he brought up and the fact that humans live in the environment, whether you like it or not, whether you think humans are above all other animals or above the environment is irrelevant. We live in this environment, it's the only one we have. And I'll say I'm in support of drilling and fracking and the benefits that come along with it. But your statement that you want to have all the energy you possibly can and the earth is not overpopulated, well, if you take that to its extreme, basically you end up with a lot of people needing a lot of energy, creating a lot of heat, which is not going to be good in the long run. No one can argue with that. That if we get too hot on this planet, humans are done. So for our own benefit, there has to be some control.
Yeah, so it's one valuable thing that I have. So I'm not a professional chemist, I'm a professional philosopher, which helps me with one thing. That's really clear use of terminology. So the terminology of the environment is a very deceptive and confused term, because environment is a relational term. It's the environment of something. So you say like, oh, I have a nice environment at home, or I have a nice working environment, or the mosquito environment. And what I'm talking about here is the human environment. And the human environment is interrelated with nature, and it's interrelated with other environments. We have to be very clear if we're talking about, if you say we live in this environment, it creates a certain kind of ambiguity. Whereas if we focus on, okay, what does the human environment need? Then we can focus on what maximally will benefit humans, including looking at any kind of network effects with other environments, or say with the atmosphere, which you're raising with.
Sure, it was very clear to me that you were talking about the human environment.
Yeah, no,
which I take issue with, because the human environment is part of the overall.
No, but what I'm saying is you acknowledge that, but you have to, your standard of values that you create. So let's say you could show that emitting certain amounts of greenhouse gases was leading the Earth to some fiery fate.
Mm-hmm.
Then obviously, in concern for the human environment, you would have to take action about that. Now, I dispute that, and I dispute that entire movement focus, and I think it's another example of stemming from a hostility toward technology. And I mean, just to give you my basic assessment of it, it is a political movement. That the whole movement is a political movement, and I think like the easiest way to show that is how it deliberately tries to drastically oversimplify the issue of predicting climate, and drastically oversimplifies the key issue, the key piece of scientific knowledge that we do have with regard to CO2, which is the greenhouse effect. So there are two things here, and if you're on our mailing list, we talk about this a lot, but one is that predicting the climate is an insanely complex system. So the reason why we're focused on CO2 obsessively in this, which is a very trace gas in the atmosphere, which has been increasing in concentration as we generate more greenhouse gases, is because there is a huge amount of political funding and obsession in the academic establishment for this particular thing. But we do not have anywhere near the knowledge of climate to say predict it long term, which is why all the climate modelers are completely unable to predict it. So because they do not have this ability at all, but because they have this idea that CO2 must be destructive, what they do is they try to oversimplify, they try to claim that the greenhouse effect logically proves that there's going to be catastrophic global warming. And the problem is the greenhouse effect by itself suggests the opposite, because what they assume is that as you go up parts per million, so let's say you start out with 280, which is pre-industrial, let's say they say we're heading toward 450. The idea is that it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and it's just gonna, we're just gonna go up this slope, and it's a disaster. Except for the fact that the greenhouse effect says the opposite, is that as CO2 goes up, the impact of it and the forcing of it goes down. So if you believe in catastrophic global warming, you have to believe that the greenhouse effect is drastically sort of inverted and compounded by what's called positive feedback loops. Now these are extremely hypothetical and cannot predict the climate. Now it's not so bad that, say, Michael Mann, who's the famous climatologist at this school, it's not so bad that he believes this, or I don't know what it even means for him to believe something. But it's that it is promoted as, I get all the time, oh, you don't believe in, first of all, you don't believe in global warming, which is not how to say it. It's, do you believe in catastrophic global warming? And then it's oh, you don't believe it, what, you don't believe in the greenhouse effect? And I said, no, I do. And it implies non-catastrophic global warming. The fact that this whole movement is pushing forward pseudoscience and trying to intimidate the public in the name of science into believing a very hypothetical conclusion shows that it is ideological and political in nature, and it's not a scientific movement. And if you want one more fact, just what it does to kids is criminal. In terms of teaching kids that they know for sure that we're heading toward disaster and that they know how to predict the climate and they should write President Bush and President Obama. It has all of the activities of a cult or a dogma. So if there were the risk of catastrophic global warming, which I can't say is impossible. I mean, again, we can't predict the climate like that. But if there were, they would be doing it the biggest disservice. Plus, they're against nuclear power, which is the only way to deal with it, if there were. Yes?
One issue that gets brought up a lot when discussing fossil fuels of any kind is that they're ultimately a finite resource. We'll run out of oil and we'll run out of natural gas at some hypothetical point, and that becomes a justification for why you need to go running through renewable energy.
So why is that? I sort of addressed that, but why is that just? So if you're going to run, if in 200 years there won't be any more, why is that a problem? Like, why do you care? Unless you have a really long life expectancy.
Yeah, I don't know. We can all hope, right?
Yeah, but it's sort of a weird focus. I mean, imagine if they had focused on that 200 years ago. Like, given their knowledge of how to create resources, they had very little. So they would just not do anything, and then they would have died prematurely, and then we wouldn't have all the technologies. So there's a wrong,
Well, I think part of it comes back to, you talked about the population bomb earlier. One of the groups associated with that was the Club of Rome.
Yeah.
And there's sort of this almost Malthusian narrative that goes on. Run out of food was the original narrative, and then run out of energy sort of more.
Yeah. This is a narrative that's been going on forever.
Okay.
Because so the basic issue is people don't understand resources at all. So it's the issue of there are two views of resources. One is false and one is true. And the false view is the given view, and the true view is the created view. So the given view is basically that Mother Nature is our mother, and she gives us a bunch of resources, and there's only a certain amount. And if we take them too fast, we're going to run out, and then future generations are going to be up the creek. And this is completely inconsistent with history because we have more resources at our disposal than anyone in history has ever had, which on the given view would be the opposite of the truth. Now, of course, today everyone says, oh, but now, tomorrow we're going to run off the cliff. It's really coming, except now fracking has sort of pushed that back 30 years. So now it's, okay, 30 years, it's going to peak and decline. And the fallacy is, the history is no accident. The thing here is, what is a resource? So a resource is something that performs a service for a human being. Now, nature is just a bunch of raw materials, little to none of which in their native state provide a service to a human being. Even water and food, like in the natural state, A, it's hard to get enough of them, but B, you don't even know if they're safe without technology. So they're not even really resources. So what makes something a resource is the human mind. So the human mind is what takes coal from a useless bunch of black stuff into the thing that led to the rise of Great Britain and the rise of the US as an industrial power. Human ingenuity is what takes oil from black glop that just sticks on people, when they walk on the beach, or an occasional torch, to the lifeblood of civilization. What takes natural gas from a health hazard, to the basis of modern fertilizer and modern agriculture. What takes uranium, a useless, odd rock, to something that you can get, a million times the energy from per unit of volume that you can from oil. The thing with resources is to realize that they are created, and the world is just a bunch of matter and energy, a bunch of raw materials waiting for human ingenuity to use. And so the key is to be free to develop those raw materials. And the key problem we face is what I call the green gauntlet, which is that we have a hostility in our government toward development. And thus, it's harder and harder and harder to use your own land in the way you choose. So it's harder to build a nuclear power plant, it's harder to build a factory, it's harder to drill for stuff. And the only thing we need to be concerned about with resources is, are we free to create them? Are we free to create them? And the other aspect of it is just economics, which everyone should take in some form or another. You learn that. We learn about the current, at any given state, resources are finite. There's a certain amount, and that's important. And the thing that reflects that is the prices. So right now, let's say we have a relatively high price of oil, which means that it's relatively difficult to produce oil compared to, say, natural gas. And as I indicated before, that's going to push transportation probably toward natural gas, which is great. So in general, you have this mass creation of resources, and then improving upon that, you have the relative intelligent use of resources using the price system. So the whole thing is, it's all kind of a derivative of Marx's old claim that capitalism would inevitably fail. And he said, capitalism couldn't produce, and the new version is either capitalism is going to run out, or capitalism is going to just, pollute the whole world into oblivion. And the fact is, we've become a lot richer and a lot cleaner, and if we had real capitalism, we'd be a lot richer and a lot cleaner. Yes?
I have a sort of more technical question, which I think you might not know the answer to, but maybe you can refer me to somebody.
Okay, sounds good.
That's, I was at a talk a lot like this a few years ago, and the guy, he was from some specific drilling company, and he was talking about something they were doing with produced water, wastewater that comes out of the well,
Uh-huh.
which is one of the scariest things to me because even if it's safe when you're doing it right, you can always have somebody that cuts corners and just says, well, we're just going to dump it in the creek. We had that a couple of times here, I think. And anyway, he said his company was able to use about half of that water that comes out of the well and put it into the next well,
Uh-huh.
which is, I think, exciting because that gets rid of a lot of the problems. If you can make that 100% of the water, that's like perfect. So do you know anything about that, or that's progressing?
I mean, there's just a lot of, it's not a new technology, but I think the mass deployment of it is new. So they have a very big economic interest in doing something like that. I mean, if you, I don't know, I usually give a handout with my email. I mean, Alex@alexepstein.com, if you can remember, you can always email me. There's a guy named Pierre Desrochers who's from University of Toronto, and he's really good both in the present and in the past on sort of the history of voluntary recycling under capitalism. And recycling is a kind of a mixed issue because a lot of times it's encouraged in ways that I think just waste a lot of energy, and you're better off throwing it away or burning it in a clean way than spending all this time sorting through all your stuff. But the things that you do want to recycle often are things like this, where you have a pretty large disposal cost. And if you can reuse it, and you have proximity benefits too if you can reuse it. So if you email me, I certainly know people who know the answer to this, but you're right, I'm not like on the cutting edge myself. I'm not out from the field. All right, well, thanks for coming. If anyone wants to say hi, I'll be right here.
Thank you.